Hey folks, John Kelly. Welcome back to the Law Enforcement Life Coach Sometimes Heroes Need Help podcast. This podcast is being brought to you by On Target Claims, where their motto is on target from setback to settlement. Now listen, a little background. I've worked with these guys on the job, on the street for over 25 years, man, and they have always done the right thing and have always had my back. Now, in this second chapter, let them have your back. Right? You wouldn't go to court without an attorney. Why would you go up against an insurance company without representation, right? They represent you, the policyholder, when you go up against an insurance company submitting a claim. And I can tell you this, right? From beginning to end, they're going to be with you during the entire process. They're going to properly document that claim with the latest technology. And then when it comes time to getting things fixed, they've got a complete stable of vendors that are certified that are going to get it done right the first time. They also offer a pre-loss planning and policy review. So you know exactly what you're covered for, right? Make sure that you're adequately covered. The time to find out that you're not isn't after that horrific event. Okay? So give my friends a call at On Target Claims, 561-208-1775, or go to their website, ontargetclaims.com. They cover the entire state of Florida, offices in Fort Lauderdale and Tampa, and tell them John sent you. And now, let's get to the episode. We'll take care of it. Hey, folks, John Kelly. Welcome back to the Law Enforcement Life Coach Sometimes Heroes Need Help podcast. Son of a bitch, man. I am sitting down with Peter Forcelli, and a public servant who, you know, when we all said, you know, we swore to protect and defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic, who would have thought, man, that shit would actually come to ring true, that our problems would be more domestic than foreign. Peter, NYPD, ATF, really made his bones back in the day. And if you've heard of a little case called Fast and Furious with the ATF and guns walking down to Mexico, this was a shit show of a case. And Peter was not intentionally, but put in the crosshairs over it. He had a stellar career. He wrote a book, The Deadly Path, How Operation Fast and Furious, Bad Lawyers Armed the Mexican Cartels. And you know what? It sounds like a sensational title, factual, and a little bit heartbreaking, right? So we're sitting down with Pete, and we're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And brother, thanks for your time, man. I really appreciate you sitting down with us.
Honored to be here, John. Always good to talk with another cop. Always.
Oh my God. Listen, brother. So you we're going to go back a little bit back in the day. So you were an NYPD guy. You started your career with the NYPD, and then you like a lot of guys do, they get all that experience at the city, local, state level, and then they make that move federally. And so if you could, man, just, you know, walk us through that a little bit, your time at NYPD, and really the catalyst, if you will, for you looking to go to the ATF.
Sure. Yeah, I actually started with the New York City Housing Authority Police Department. Back in the day, they came off one test. So if you took the NYPD test, you could have got picked for housing, transit, or NYPD. So I got picked for housing, and I started in January 1987. I was 20 years old, just a kid.
Yeah.
And at first I was disappointed. I wanted to be an NYPD cop. And I was like, housing, well, you know. But anyway, it turned out to be a great job. Smaller job. You learn how to talk to people. Sometimes you'd walk a foot post alone, like in the project, sometimes at night. So you got to learn how to deal with people real quick.
And so, you're not going in the elevator, you're going up and down stairs, right? Are you jumping in the elevator? Going to these?
Sometimes, but they wanted you to patrol the stairs because a lot of things happened in the stairwells of the projects.
No doubt.
A lot of arrests, a lot of drug use, sometimes sexual assaults. So it was a great, very rewarding job. And then eventually I became a detective in the housing police. And then Giuliani came in and merged the three departments together. And I wound up staying a detective originally in the 47th Precinct Detective Squad, which was a busy place. Yeah. And then I wound up going to the Bronx Homicide Task Force.
Okay.
So, that was in, let me see, when 1997, early
Okay.
1997.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
Nice.
which was great. I mean, the Bronx back then was averaging 600 murders a year,
I
which
was
is kind
gonna
of
say, man,
sick.
we were rocking and rolling in the '90s. So
Yeah.
yeah,
It's
man.
one county, 600 murders a year. So, but I started working with the feds because NYPD finally got their head out of their backside. Because for years they were saying, we don't have a gang problem. We don't have a gang problem. They were in denial. Finally, they realized that they did. So they allowed us in the Bronx Homicide Task Force to start working with feds. So I got to work
Okay.
with FBI, ATF, DEA. The FBI guys were different animal.
Right.
Not going to say anything bad about them, but they kind of worked as a I don't know, like, a larger entity with marching orders from headquarters, where I found DEA and ATF, they had a lot more latitude to do things as
Sure.
individuals. So, I worked with ATF more so than DEA. And,
Right.
2001, I decided to jump ship. Now, the catalyst was, we were doing a lot of, felon in possession cases to flip guys and build bigger cases, going after murderers, going after home invaders and whatnot. Because, I mean, they didn't want to do the time, especially doing time in another state, where their family could visit them. So, but I
Mm.
had I
And
had a
so
case.
they were motivated to work.
Oh yeah, I mean, this was the magic recipe. I mean, we were solving cases that I never thought we would ever solve, and I certainly wasn't doing that as a homicide detective because people weren't afraid to go to Rikers Island because they'd go there and meet friends, get in
Right.
shape, get your teeth fixed, you come out and
Yeah.
you're a bigger,
Work
better
out.
criminal.
Work
Yeah,
out. Get lose a few pounds. Right.
yeah. So, but what happened was that my last year, I had a case where it was my last state murder trial. It was a kid named Joseph Dauphin, 4 years old, was beat to death by his stepfather. Kid shit himself. He was mentally handicapped.
Yeah.
So the guy changes him, and then instantly the kid soils himself again. And the kid's mentally. So the guy went into a rage and beat this kid to death, and he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. At that
Four.
same around the
Four.
same time frame, yeah,
Four.
four.
You said four.
Yeah, four. Isn't that appalling? So, but around the same time frame, I had a felon in possession who was a bad guy. He only had like one felony though, but he was a thug. He got sentenced to 4 years for possessing a gun, and then the people with more felonies were getting sentenced to like 15 years just for having the gun on them. And again, these weren't like guys going. These weren't target shooters or hunters. These were
Right.
violent
Right. They
felons.
were the criminal element. Yeah.
Yeah, so but I got along with the ATF guys, and they're like, "Hey, why don't you come over?" And when I saw that result, I'm like, "What?" Kind of spinning my wheels here. I love being a homicide detective. I love the NYPD, but I was like, I could have more impact if I jump ship and go to ATF because they have an infinite budget. It's not like when you're a homicide detective, you catch a case, you got 4 days to clear it, and then you got another case.
Right. No
So
doubt.
where with ATF, if you have a case and it takes 2 years to work it and you need travel, it's like, okay, go ahead.
Do your
So
job. Yeah. Get it
yeah.
done.
So, I mean, it just made sense. So I jumped ship in June of 2001 and I was sworn in. Our offices for New York were in the World Trade Center. So I got sworn in there and I just was basically doing the same stuff I was doing as a homicide detective, but now with an ATF badge, on
And
ATF's
you're
payroll.
you're still working out of basically the New York office.
Yeah, still mostly working on cases in the Bronx, frankly.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a nice transition, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. Absolutely.
Nice. And then so this little incident occurs on 9/11, and that starts a little some more things in motion for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I was there. I got there after the first plane hit. So, I arrived on the scene. I remember running to a detective outside named John Faust. We went upstairs to the plaza because, World Trade Center, the two towers didn't sit at ground level. They were on a mezzanine. And so I was there. I was actually looking at a young female EMT who was tending to some guy who was already down on the ground. And I remember the second plane hit, and I turned around and looked back where she was tending to this person. I looked, and she was now on the ground. And I just literally watched the color leave her face. Clearly, she was gone. So I was like, oh crap. And then while I'm still there, you're trying to get people to leave because people's gathering around. Emergency workers need to come in and out. So that's when I started to see the jumpers, and first jumper hit the ground. Then the sound, I could still hear that sound in my head.
Sure.
And then second jumper hit like one of those overhangs where people can hang out underneath, smoke a cigarette, be out of the rain. And so I was like, this is not a safe place to be. No. So ran back down the stairs. Saw some friends walk into the South Tower right before it collapsed. Vinny Dans, John Coughlin, and Walter Weaver, 3 cops I work with. I actually ran and sought cover under a fire truck, and which is stupid. A fire truck is not going to support the weight of a falling building.
It seems like when there's nothing in the fire, and then there's a fire truck, I'll give you a pass, brother. That seems like a logical option at the time.
Yeah. So, but I eventually got out from under there and just ran for my life. But yes,
Yeah.
afterwards, it spent 3 days on the site, but it took a lot out of me because, in total, I lost 7 good friends, 6 cops, one cop who became a fireman. And, the 2 of the guys I mentioned, John Coughlin and Vinny Dans, I tried out for NYPD's emergency service unit with those guys, and I got weeded out because of fear of heights. I
No
couldn't
kidding.
climb the Verrazano Bridge, so I kind of felt guilty. I was dealing with some PTSD and some survivor's guilt.
Right.
Truth be told, I knew I had the survivor's guilt issue. I couldn't even go to funerals, man. I'd never missed a police funeral, and then
Right.
after that, I just couldn't bring myself to go. But for the PTSD part, man, I was in denial for quite a
Well,
long time after that.
Pete, let me give you a little bit of a pass, brother, because not for nothing, we didn't know what that was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There was no acronym. It was nobody talked about it. It was just, well, you're having a tough time. You fucking, I don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why I'm feeling this way. Because you're a fucking human being, and you've been exposed to some horrific stuff. So
Yeah.
you you're kind of wrestling, man. You're wrestling and thinking you need to change.
Yeah, like well, a couple things happened, man. Like there was one day I was driving home. I moved out of New York and moved to New Jersey for my last 3 years while working in the New York Field Division. And one day I was driving home, and you're gonna laugh because it's kind of funny. Um, about 25 minutes from my house, I'm on the New Jersey Turnpike, and I start to feel chest pains. I'm like, oh shit, I'm having a heart attack. So what do normal people do? They pull over and call 911, or they
Yeah.
even stop at, there's a toll plaza there. Stop at the
Yeah.
toll plaza. Hey, I need help. No, I decide I'm going to drive myself to the hospital.
That
It's
seems
only
like
20 minutes.
seems like the
Yeah.
most prudent thing to do.
Right. So I get to the hospital. They do the test. They put this EKG on me. They take blood. And I didn't notice at the time, but they could they could tell if you had a heart attack by markers in your blood.
Okay, nice.
So they're like, well, you didn't have a heart attack. So there's a whole bunch of discussions trying to figure out what's going on. And finally, the nurse and the doctor, they're like, hey, you were at 9/11. Did you ever think that you might have PTSD? And I was, of course, I'm not the kind of person to be really rude, but I was in denial. I'm the police. I'm the person you call for help. I don't ask for help. So it was an interesting discussion. They gave me some Demerol. I went home. The furniture was never quite as comfortable as it was that night. But at that point, I decided, you know what, driving past Ground Zero all the time because the U.S. Attorney's office that I work with was nearby. I was like, I need a change. So I put in for a transfer, and I put in for it was actually a promotion for the Jacksonville office, the Savannah office, the Dallas office, and the Phoenix office. And it was to get away from the stress. And who do I got picked for Phoenix.
Solution to the problem, man. Right?
I thought it turned out I was going from the frying pan into the fire.
Yeah, man. I mean, Phoenix, fresh start, and before you get there, you get a little intel, and there's some. Would it be safe to say that there was some fixing to do at the Phoenix office, that maybe morale wasn't at a real high, and you're walking into this in the hopes of maybe turning the ship around, right?
Well, when I got there, I didn't know exactly what was wrong. It was actually an eye opener. Like I remember my first weekend there, a couple of my agents, Mario and Billy, they called me. And like in New York, if you made an arrest where you got several guns in a car with some bad guys in it, it would be like news. It would literally make the news. Arsenal of weapons seized. So it was a first weekend. I get a call from them to Saturday, and basically they're like, "Hey, we got a call from a licensed gun dealer. Guy just walked in with a bag full of money, and he wanted 13 AK-47 variant rifles." Just basically everything he had on the shelf. Okay, so we roll out there. The transaction happens, which is this normal course of business. Like the dealer would call us, we would set up outside. The transaction would happen. We would follow
if I can interrupt you, just so I can add some points for the listener.
Sure.
Most of the dealers, they're legit. They don't want people doing straw purchases, and you have for the most part, a pretty good relationship with the firearms dealers, the legitimate firearms dealers that are out there, A1 shooters and all these other places.
Absolutely. I mean, in my 20 years with ATF, I only encountered one corrupt gun dealer. One.
Right.
And this is how things would play out. But in this particular instance, they call us, we watch the transaction happen. We would follow the car off the premises because we're not going to endanger people shopping in a gun store. We're not going to endanger the dealer. We certainly know that these people are, affiliated with cartels. So we also don't want them to know that the dealers are tipping us off because it'll get them smoked. So
Yeah, no
so
doubt.
anyway, we follow the car. It gets on I-10, which heads south. We would never let them get very far. So we stopped the car. We asked the questions like cops do, where you coming from? They lie, different stories. We develop probable cause. So I tell my agents, all right, let's take them. So they go, we got to call the U.S. Attorney's office. Now in New York, it would have been, all right, take them, put them in jail from the U.S. Attorney people. Put them in jail. We'll draw a complaint up and take them down to the magistrate tomorrow. Here it was different. They're like, all right, let them go, and we'll indict it later. And I'm like, okay, it's different. But I'm a new supervisor in a new region of the country, different office. This is how they did it there. And
So basically, like, okay. You're basically giving them a notice to appear, or not even. You're not even a notice to appear.
Right. And what bothered me is now you're dealing with some bad guys who are arming themselves with guns. No, granted, they're arming them to traffic them, not to use them perhaps. So, but what bothered me is, all right, this car stop could have went sideways if these guys decided to load up guns and shoot at us. So I'm like, we're letting them go only to go get them again later. So you're asking me to endanger my people again, but still, sometimes. I'm new.
Yeah.
Right. So, but anyway, I would watch similar situations unfold again and again. And what I would learn is there were no indictments, right? So this would happen. And then there were other instances where like they took this position at the U.S. Attorney's office. Like once the gun made it to Mexico, the crime, basically the body of the crime was in Mexico, so we're not going to prosecute it. So we were dealing with many instances where we would stop the buyers, get confessions, and no one would go to jail. We would deal with other cases where guns were recovered in Mexico, right? Because we didn't know it was a straw purchase because the dealers aren't Kreskin. They can't like telepathically tell. So a good straw purchaser is going to get that gun, and we might not find out about it unless it's used in a crime because it's an act of deception. The dealer doesn't know. Right. So in those instances, same thing. We would find the buyer. We would ask questions, get confessions, call the U.S. Attorney's office. Well, the gun is in Mexico. The body of the crime is in Mexico. The problem is, more often than not, that gun was found next to a body or multiple bodies.
Right.
So no one was going to jail. And I would watch this unfold again and again. And then sometimes they would, take it to the county. And if there was an underlying charge, the county would take it. But the problem is we're federal agents. We shouldn't be burdening the county.
Why are you going to the local prosecutor's office to file federal charges? Well, actually, they wouldn't be able to file federal charges.
Right.
You had to find local state charges, right?
Yes.
Pete.
Yes.
So you paint this picture that there's guys that doing their jobs. This is the thing. This is the learning curve, though. If I keep doing my job and I'm passionate about keeping guns out of the hands of the cartel, I'm going to the ATF. So that's why that's the assignment I want. If I want to work dope, I'm going to the DEA, right? I want to work guns because guns kill people, and especially in the hands of the cartel. It had to be a kick in the nuts, man, for your agents to put all this time in, stopping people with guns. People that buy guns have guns. They're not driving because they got to worry about getting ripped as well.
Yes.
So there's always guns on scene. You're having to reach and go back, 2 times, do double the amount of work. Imagine as a boss trying to keep your guys' heads not only in the game and like keep them motivated to do their job. That's hard on a good day, but they spend all this time on a case and it doesn't get filed.
Right. Well, I mean, look, the other thing that I say, and this really was kind of heartbreaking for me. Look, I was a new leader, new manager, never been, I had 22 years of law enforcement experience when I got this job, but I had never, the old saying, when you're, a detective, your headaches are your cases. When you're a boss, all your people's cases, become your headaches. But I would watch. So, I mean, the successes I had in New York weren't mine. They were shared with prosecutors. So you needed prosecutors to write warrants. You needed prosecutors to get subpoenas before grand juries, to get court orders. So I would watch my agents try and constantly be told no. So you come to this realization really quickly, like, hey, my people will never reach their full potential, but it's not because of them. It's because they can't get the prosecutors to do their jobs. So to me, that was incredibly frustrating. So that's why what happened was, a lot of these straw purchasing schemes, guys would go stop at a gun store in Yuma, for example, which is in Yuma County, then drive up to Flagstaff and then drive to Maricopa. So you had like a lot of these incidents involved multiple counties. So that became complicated when you're trying to push a case And the county's like, well, I can't prosecute this aspect of it. So what happened
Right.
was I had to formulate a partnership with the state attorney general's office. And it's an office that didn't even have a
A
team that
building,
worked with
right?
guns.
And I remember in the book, a building that you look out when you looked out your window, you looked at that building, like, and then finally, like the light bulb came on, like, maybe let me go to the state attorney general's office here in Phoenix.
Right. Right. And it was funny because I met with these people and they made it clear, like, hey, we don't really work gun cases, and they heard me out. So I'm like, okay, this is going to be a work in progress. I'm probably going to be multiple meetings. The amazing thing to me was I tell them exactly what we're dealing with, what we're looking at. And so they're like, okay, we're in. I'm like, all right, well, what's next? I go, let's go. Literally like that night we
Dude,
went live.
if you could have done a backflip, you would have.
Oh, absolutely. And then when I got back and told my agents, hey, there's some light at the end of the tunnel, they were ecstatic. But the funny thing is, part of this was done because I was hoping that if the U.S. Attorney's Office realized they weren't the only game in
they'd
town,
be pissed, right? They'd be like, they're doing our job. There'd be some
yes,
pride, right?
and they couldn't care less.
They
I
could
mean,
give a shit.
yeah. I
Oh,
mean, if somebody was doing my job, I would have been offended. And,
I'd
all right,
be,
I got to
I
step
would
up.
be offended. So to keep everybody up to speed, you're an ATF agent, a new supervisor in Phoenix, and your guys, none of their cases are getting filed. They're doing they basically, when you talk about the silver platter, all the elements are met. Probably it's on video as well. Signed documents, fraudulently, confessions, nice bow, everything's wrapped up. We got the guns too. We got the guns. They didn't leave Phoenix. We got the guns. We got the people in possession. We got the documents. We got video. We got perfect witnesses. And the United States Attorney's Office doesn't want it. Doesn't want. They're saying, I don't even know what they're saying. Release, and we'll indict later.
Right. Right. And it's funny because it got to a point at one point where it's like when you're an agent and you bring a case to the U.S. Attorney's Office, because it's not like local prosecutors where they pretty much take anything. You got to sell your case. So I also had to, impress upon my agents, hey man, go there and follow up on your case, sell your case. So there's one instance I referenced in the book where this guy, Mario, young guy, energetic guy, he goes to the U.S. Attorney's Office to follow up on his case. Now, our cases were they were presented in these things called blue jackets.
Yes.
It's basically like a medium blue colored, cardboard cover with a bunch of reports in it and attachments and whatnot. So Mario goes there. He comes back. When he gets back, he comes in my office. And I wasn't a guy who ruled with an iron fist. I got along with my troops. He throws it on my desk. He goes, see, boss, I followed up on it. And I look, and it was basically the blue jacket, which was, again, medium blue, was bleached completely white because it sat on Emory Hurley's on his windowsill, rather, for so long with no decision that literally the document was bleached white.
It got bleached by the sun.
And they declined it. So it was basically, that's why he brought the case report back, was like, it's been there too long, it's declined. We even had some cases where we waited for decisions so long, there were about a dozen of them, that the statute of limitations ran out.
See, because I remember getting in trouble as a detective if you don't have a meeting and a sit down with the state attorney within 21 days, because you got 21 days to file.
Right. Well, they would punt well past that.
Well, but at the local level, you'd get jammed up by the state attorney because they want the case, right? They want work because it's a partnership, right? We want bad people off the street. We want people that are doing illegal things held accountable. That's insane. I'm glad you mentioned Hurley. So I said to myself, I'm reading your book, I'm saying to myself, every interaction, I'm saying to myself, the Mexican cartels have him in their pocket. That's what I'm saying. That the only reason why somebody would be that derelict in their duty and make as many excuses for not doing their job as he did was that he was getting paid by the Mexican cartel.
If the only cases that we took were Mexican-related cases, I would believe you. But I had another group of agents, a small one that worked for me, that focused on Aryan Brotherhood cases. And similar excuses would be made by Emory with those cases as well. So, look, do I know whether or not Emory was on somebody's payroll? No. Do I think he was? No. I just think he was incessantly lazy And it was easier for him because look, he liked to go out and have coffee with people. I caught him a couple times having like long lunches. I think it was easy for him to say no because cases involve work and going in the courtroom, and saying no is less, less hassles. So,
yeah, but you gotta say yes every now and then, man.
Well, they did, but usually it was a case that would go nowhere, that would rapidly be pled out. Like another one, I remember one time one of his prosecutors came over. We arrested a guy with ammo, right?
Right.
And
Yep.
so they came over. Oh, this was a great case. I'm like, okay, he's an illegal alien in possession of ammo. I know you're not supposed to say illegal alien anymore. I still say it.
Okay. Yeah.
You know why? Because they got a stat and they deported the guy. Right. So, but it didn't involve them going into the courtroom. It didn't involve. So that's the kind of stuff so again, that's why I believed honestly in my heart, even to this day, it wasn't corruption. It was certainly malfeasance, but it was like they wanted the easy path, no work, no getting in front of a courtroom, no, having to argue your case with a judge. That's just, I mean, I could be wrong, but that's
right.
how I felt about it.
Pete, but see, the problem that, I don't want to say the problem that I have, but the observation is, like, somebody's supposed to be. This wasn't at just the state. I'm sorry, the United States Attorney's Office at Hurley's level. Like, somebody's got to be. He answers to somebody, right?
Oh yeah, no, and they were just as full of excuses as Hurley was. And look, if you when you read the book, Hurley's predecessor was no better. A woman named Rachel. I mean, she. Same thing. I mean, she's the one that came up with the whole corpus delicti policy, which was, hey, if the gun is in Mexico, we can't prosecute it. That's not true because we're charging him with lying on the form. We would have the form in our possession.
Sure.
So it's just one thing after the other. And then it went all the way up to the U.S. attorney himself, as you saw in the book.
Right.
We were complaining about what was happening. But the amazing thing was, for years, we were told that once the gun made it to Mexico, the body of the crime was in Mexico, we can't prosecute it. Excuse, excuse, excuse. Well, as you know, later on, there was a case, which I'm sure we'll talk about, where the strategy was to let the guns go to Mexico. So wait a minute. How does that work?
I just, it's there's so many things that are problematic on so many different levels. And what I don't want is the listener to get confused. So we're walking down this road in a nice, orderly, matter of fact, chronological way. So your frustrations are in getting cases filed, people prosecuted, but you're recovering guns. Your group, is recovering group one.
Thousands.
Group one,
Phoenix
right?
Group One. We recovered in 1 year alone. We took over 2,000 guns into custody that were bound for.
If I can say, right, fucked up that they're not getting prosecuted, but these Group One is doing an amazing job of keeping these guns out of the hands of the Mexican cartel.
Yes.
You know what? I'll take my wins where I can get them. All right. So nobody's actually going to jail. It would be nice, but bad guys aren't getting guns from the tactics that they're employing in Phoenix, because Group One is working with firearms, legitimate dealers. They're building cases. They're conducting a stop before the vehicle gets too far down the road. They're pulling it. Everybody's safe. Somebody's on the windshield. How you doing? Look at all these guns. Confiscate.
Right.
Job well done.
And look, you point out something that I think is important for the listener to think about. Is like, what we were doing wasn't magic. This was routine police work. This was nothing fancy. And the dealers, they were great. Like, they would tip us off. So what happened is one of three scenarios would unfold with the dealers. I think it's important because I know that some folks like to demonize gun dealers as some sort of.
Oh, yeah. And that's why I wanted to make sure that you had said the vast majority of them are doing great things. They're legitimate, very mindful business owners.
Roughly 90% of the tips that we got came from dealers. And it was tips about gun traffickers. It was tips about felons trying to buy guns. It was tips about, hey, there's a guy that I've heard about who's not licensed who's selling guns. So, I mean, there were a few things. But one of three scenarios would unfold. One is the one I described. They would call us. We would get out there, set up surveillance, watch the transaction happen, stop the guns, right? Other scenario that might unfold is, hey, Pete, this guy's in here and like, hey, I'm sorry, whatever the person's name was of the day, because there were several. We can't get there because we're out on a car stop now. All right, I'll tell them they failed the NICS check, or it's the NICS didn't come back. They'll have to come back tomorrow or the next day. Can you be here? Yes. Nice. So and then finally, hey man, we're at training this week. All right, listen, I'll just tell them they didn't pass the NICS. So the transaction wouldn't happen. Right. So the dealers weren't given guns, letting them drive off into the sunset. Sure. So but what happened is when we would recover the guns, those guns wouldn't be traced back from crime scenes, which I think is important for people to know. Is like what happens is when straw buyers buy a gun and the dealers didn't know about it, we'll find out about that straw buyer because the gun, when it's recovered at a crime scene, whether it's here or in Mexico or whatever, is traced. So, but because we were recovering the guns, the dealers weren't getting phone calls asking them to say, hey, who did you sell that gun to? Because we knew that would later change, which was troubling to me.
Right. There was one point you had a case, and I'm sorry, I don't have the book to refer, but there's some lingo. There's like time to crime.
Yes. Correct.
Explain to that, because like you had some cases where the time to explain that, what time to crime is and the significance of that in making a case.
Sure. Like what ATF does is they look at intelligence too. So time to crime is basically the time that when a gun is traced, for example, if anything that happens with less than a 2-year time to crime is considered suspicious. Now, what that means is the gun is traced to its first retail sale. So that's not like from manufacturer to wholesaler to dealer. It's from when the dealer sells that gun to a member of the public.
To me, right.
Right. So now anything less than 2 years is looked at. I'm not saying that means that they're looking at the buyer and investigating them, but they go, okay, why is this gun? Because most people, they don't sell a gun that quickly. Then there's times where we'll look at stuff and it's like, okay, well, I had the gun, I shot it. We had a baby, we didn't want to have a gun in the house. Okay, no problem. But so less than 2 years might be suspicious.
Less than 2 years, you're going to take a look at it.
Right. And it could be a look that takes 10 seconds.
Right.
But we had one case, and it's the one I know you're referencing, where the gun was purchased and 48 hours later was used in a shooting in a town called Cananea, which is like 42 miles south of the Mexican border. 21 people were killed. 4 cops, Mexican cops. 4 other Mexican cops were abducted because the cartel, they don't roll in like 1 or 2 guys. They roll it in numbers.
This isn't the movies, man. Fucking right. Everybody dies. Everybody dies.
So, but they took 4 other cops. So they killed 4 amongst 21 people. They take 4 other cops into the desert, torture them, beat them, leave them for dead, or maybe hoping they die. So the gun is recovered, and we find out it had been purchased only 48 hours earlier. So my agents go out and they identify the straw purchaser. They get a confession from him. Yeah, I bought the gun. He identifies who he gave the gun to. So they go and find that person. And I also helped get it across the border. That case is presented to the U.S. Attorney's Office. It's declined because they didn't like the informant and they didn't like who tipped us off to the initial purchase.
Was that informant CR 921?
Yeah. And they also didn't like that the gun was in Mexico, so the body of the crime is in Mexico. But wait a minute, there's carnage here. You got 21 people dead. Some of them I would assume are, regular honest citizens. There's certainly 4 cops that are dead. How do you turn this case away? But this is the kind of stuff that I would see all the time down there.
Right. And so this problem, you're not getting any traction with the United States Attorney's Office. So you've said, all right, what other angles can I have my guys do their jobs and us start getting some of these cases filed? And so you go to the Attorney General's office for Phoenix.
For Arizona, the state.
For Arizona, for Phoenix, for state of Arizona, and you start working cases with them. You come across, I forget his name.
Victor Varela.
It was somebody that worked for the state attorney. I mean the Attorney General's office, who was very excited about working these cases with you guys.
Oh yeah, no, that's Pat Zinicola. He was a gentleman. Yeah. Like I said, we met with him, and it's funny because the Attorney General of Arizona himself, Terry Goddard, literally popped his head in the meeting, and like that day we were green lighted to go. So our first big case with them was this kid named Victor Varela, who was trafficking 50 caliber rifles to Mexico, to the Juarez cartel, one of which was used to kill a Mexican police commander in a daycare center in Juarez. Right. Yeah. So same thing. We identify the network. We flip some of the straw purchasers. The case was declined. Gun is in Mexico. So again, here's a guy who was killed in a daycare center, a police commander.
Yeah.
They declined the case.
And now I think we also got ahead of ourselves. A straw purchase. Most of these guys that listen to the show and ladies will know, but there are a bunch that probably won't. When we say a straw purchase, Could you explain that for our listeners? I'm sorry, we've mentioned that a half dozen times, and I don't want somebody scratching their head going, "I have no idea what he's talking about, this straw thing." What is that?
Sure. A straw purchaser is basically, it's kind of a reference to like you know, in a farm, they have the scarecrow,
Yes.
right? The farmer can't be there to scare away the crow, so they put this scarecrow there. It's a straw man. So
Yes.
a straw purchaser is someone who does not have a criminal history, right? Their record is clean. And what happens is the cartels will look for folks like that. And not just cartels, this happens all over the country. We have
Sure.
criminals will entice someone into, hey man, can you go in there? I can't buy it myself. You know, I'll pay you some money, give you $100. All it is checking a box on a form. So what they do is the cartels would routinely look for people who were down on their luck, people who were struggling to get by, single moms, and they would convince them to go in and buy a gun. I'm gonna give you $100, $200 for that one purchase, right? And then they would have, so that person could pass the background check, and then they could take that gun and give it to the trafficker. Now, the interesting thing is a lot of the dealers would know who some of the straw purchasers were because of how they act. They act nervous, or they come in and they take a picture of a gun and then they text it to someone as if like they're seeking. It's like if you're going to go buy a gun, you know what you want. You don't need
No
to text a
doubt.
picture to
Yeah.
somebody.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they look for certain indicators, and then they would call us if there was some suspicious activity. But obviously, if someone's smooth and they go in there, or, you know, they don't do those things, then the dealer's
Right.
not going to know it's a straw purchase. But basically, it's a person who can pass a background check, who goes in and buys a gun for someone who can't.
They're not buying it for themselves. They're buying it for somebody with a criminal history that would be normally be prohibited from purchasing that gun.
Yeah, or somebody candidly who doesn't want something linking them to that gun. Like a lot of these traffickers, they might not be felons. They have cartel connections.
Right.
They don't want the gun to come back to them. Because here's the other thing that happens. They'll develop these little networks of straw buyers, and then, you know, they'll do 2 or 3 purchases, and then they wash their hands of them. Because if these guns start getting traced, that trafficker wants to have moved on. So he'll have like a whole new network of straw buyers that he's identified and groomed. And then the same thing. It's kind of like a cycle that goes on and on and on.
Right. And the other thing, so when somebody comes in as a straw buyer, purchaser, you had some, I think, that were coming in and wanting to buy like 10 or 15, like ridiculous quantities, right?
Yes, which was a big tip. Like
was that with the Caliber Arms case?
Well, with Excalibur was a whole different story. With Excalibur, one of our industry operations investigators, they're not agents, they're like compliance folks, did an inspection of the dealer's books and saw that they just looked really suspicious. So then they started looking at some traces, and he had like an interesting number of traces that came back to his shop. So what happened was he was working with a small network of traffickers, right? And he would go as far as to fill out the paperwork for them. So they would just walk in and say, hey, I'm with so-and-so, and get handed a bunch of guns. So what happened was we became aware of them through looking at historical documents. We started a very proactive investigation with the Arizona Attorney General's office, because the U.S. Attorney's office wasn't interested, because the guns that had been traced already
you've got a gun dealer that's in that 10%. That's a piece of shit. That's breaking the law.
Well, he's in that less than 10% of the dirty deal. I've seen maybe 1%. But
right, so he's somebody that needs to be dealt with.
Oh yeah. So what happens is U.S. Attorney's office declines it because the guns that had been trafficked already were already in Mexico. So it's the same excuse. So we present it to the Arizona Attorney General's office, literally like that day, and they're like, okay. So we were able to do some identify some of the straw purchasers, flip them, introduce a Phoenix Police Department undercover who we work with, who was a female, right? So she didn't look like, you know, a cop. And so this guy's coaching her. He's like, hey, you know, I could sell you 2. I can't sell you 3. And if you get stopped by ATF, like, it's better if you come in on this day because there's less agents working. So he knew how we operated.
They take a break from 11 to 12:30.
They're at the gym.
Yeah, so, he's giving her the intel that she needs to thwart getting stopped by you.
Right. So I mean, so now not only do we have straw purchasers that we flipped, we have now undercovers that are dealing with him. He's coaching the undercovers on how to avoid, you know, being detected by the ATF. So eventually we get enough information to arrest him, right? And we execute a search warrant on his store, seized a bunch of documents. In total, you know, we believed around 600 of his guns made it to Mexico before we were even onto him. What funny thing is, when he's arrested, he's read his Miranda rights, right? He's cooperative. Yeah. He's kind of arrogant guy. And he even admits, he goes, so what? About 1,000 of my guns made to Mexico. Who gives a shit? So in his mind, I guess dead Mexicans aren't as important as dead Americans. Who knows? But
Right.
but yeah, so that case was declined by the U.S. Attorney's Office. It was prosecuted by the Arizona Attorney General's office. There were some complications with the trial itself. The judge basically did a summary dismissal because he said you can't prove that you were selling to prohibited persons. But that wasn't what the Arizona Attorney General was saying. They were
Right.
saying he was fraudulently filling out the documents.
Right.
So what happened is the judge dismisses it. We're dead in the water. So we actually got a chance to speak to the jurors, and the jurors, because you could poll them, yeah, we would have convicted the guy. So then we represent the case to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they declined it again.
Yeah.
So
this is the environment you're dealing with every day going to work.
Yes.
and you're a supervisor, and listen, like on a good day, it's hard to keep your guys focused, on point, and motivated to do a thankless job on a good day, right? And so these are the obstacles that you're facing. And so help me understand. So in the Phoenix ATF office, you've got different groups.
Yes.
And I was confused because does each group work a different area or a different angle? Because I thought that like basically everybody would be working the same kind of case.
No, the way it works is, and it's different in different parts of the country. Like when I was in charge of the Miami office, we had a different structure. In Phoenix, there were two groups that mostly focused on criminal activity. Like my group, which was Phoenix 1, initially we focused on Aryan Brotherhood stuff in this project called Arrow and Mexico-bound trafficking. Okay. In group 2 was basically like they dealt with like people who were unlawfully dealing in firearms and prohibited possessors. So they would target, like, you had some folks down there who were middle-aged men who would go buy a couple of guns and then try to sell them at a gun show for for prices above what they were supplementing their income. I didn't find those cases very appealing,
right?
Frankly, because I mean, most of those guys weren't trafficking guns to hardcore felons. They were trafficking guns to other people who just liked guns. So it wasn't appealing to me. Sure. Then there was an intel group, which did intel work. And then one of the groups was the compliance people. And then we had an arson group who did no firearms cases. They mostly did arsons and bombings. So, but yes, so that was
who the hell in these offices is approving my class 3 paperwork? Is that why this damn thing takes so long?
That's a bunch of people in Martinsburg. I'm waiting for a tax stamp myself. All right, so I get it.
I wanted to give you some shit while I have you here. All right, and then there's a group 7.
Well, see, now what happened was my group was the Mexico-bound firearms trafficking group, and then in 2009, Phoenix led the nation in home invasions and kidnappings. So Phoenix PD started up this hike unit, home invasion kidnapping enforcement unit, and I had worked home invasion cases in New York, kind of like what ATF does in South Florida. They were famous for that stuff. And so my group's mission changed. We were tasked to work with the home invasion kidnapping enforcement people. The Aryan Brotherhood stuff stayed with us as well. And a new group was stood up, and it started in October because that's the federal fiscal year. So October of 2009, Phoenix Group 7 is stood up. So Hope McAllister, who was an agent that worked for me and who I went through the academy with, who had some experience. She did the Excalibur arms case, as a matter of fact.
Right.
She was transferred to that group. And then the rest of that group was supplemented with 2 new agents who were brand new. Right. And then people who were transferred in from other parts of the country. And they took over the Mexico-bound firearms trafficking investigations. Okay. But so, at that point, my group had nothing to do with that Mexico-bound stuff. We were really busy.
So you guys basically, your mission focus shifted. Home invasions and a task force with the local law enforcement personnel with jurisdiction to thwart and get involved in home invasion, robbery, and all that stuff.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So, but this is when things changed too, because if you remember before, I was talking about how the dealers used to call us. Well, the dealers were calling Group 7 too, but it wasn't long after things started to go sideways where we started to get calls from the dealers saying, "Hey, we don't understand. Like when we used to call you guys, our guns weren't getting traced. Now, all of a sudden, our guns are getting traced back from crime scenes." So it's like, okay, interesting. And that's around the time where, Brian Terry, the Border Patrol agent, got killed. Right. And then we started to hear the rumblings. And then John Dodson, who was an agent in that group who had come from Virginia, stepped forward and said, "Hey, we've been walking guns." And it was so against the grain of anything that I saw in New York or, that we were doing in our group that at first we all thought John was full of crap.
Hey, so for the listener, first, let me interrupt. You got to get this book, The Deadly Path, How Operation Fast and Furious and Bad Lawyers Armed the Mexican Cartels. Walking guns. What does that mean, Pete?
Well, there's several definitions. All of them are bad.
What's our working definition for guys on the job?
The truest form would be, let's say that I'm an undercover agent, right? So here I am a badge carrying law enforcement officer, and in an undercover role, I give a gun to somebody. For whatever street cred, for whatever reason, or a guy wants to buy a gun, I sell him a gun and I let it leave the perimeter. Because we would do all the time, we would do reverse things where, let's say you're a bad guy, you want to buy a machine gun. Okay, we would show up with a machine gun. The second your fingers touch that gun, a SWAT team was on you.
No doubt.
You possessed the gun for just enough time for us to charge you. A second way would be for for us to know you're a felon or whatever, and you have a gun on you and we decide we're not going to seize it, which was unheard of. You didn't do that because you didn't know if that gun was going to be pointed at some kid or some cop or some old lady. So, I mean, you had lawful authority to seize it, you seize it. And then the final way is, which was what happened in Fast and Furious, is that a bad guy is going to try to get his hands on a gun, right?
Because it's being purchased by a straw purchaser.
Right. You tell the dealer, make the transaction with no intent whatsoever to seize that gun. So you're allowing that gun to ride off into the horizon where in the future it can be pointed at anybody. So those are the three ways that guns would be walked. None of them were ever sanctioned by ATF prior to Fast and Furious.
Right. So how does Group 7, now I know Hope wasn't really keen on doing stops. That was not her jam.
Correct.
Somebody's got to. All right, listen. You don't stop, but somebody's got to stop them. You don't want to be there for that. That you don't. Whatever. But Group 7 is getting phone calls from dealers saying, "Hey, I got the guy. He's here now. He's obviously a straw purchaser. Okay, thanks for the call. And that guy leaves, never gets stopped, and the gun ends up going into Mexico. Not one gun.
Over 2,000.
Over 2,000 guns that we're notified of.
Yeah.
Where you, not Group 1, but Group 7, and they go, yeah, we've got a plan. We're going to do things differently, right? And that's what you guys were kind of getting fed, like that there was a different concept of interdiction that was going to be utilized. And yeah. So there were rumors, right? Talk to me.
Well, like I remember the first meeting that we were at where the numbers of guns in Fast and Furious came up, and it wasn't called Fast and Furious, by the way. The actual name of the case was Jacob Chambers et al. And others. So I heard 600 guns. And I'm like, okay. So I figured they stumbled into a historical cache of documents like we did in the Excalibur case. So I was like, okay, 600 guns. Wow, it's a good case, right? Yeah. So then I'm at a subsequent meeting, and the numbers are over 900. And then I'm like, wait a minute. Okay, you guys talking to the straw purchasers? No, we're doing something different, Pete. So in my mind, I'm like, okay, look, I'm not arrogant enough to think I know everything about policing or everything about ATF. So I'm like, trying to figure, okay, but so when I'm thinking they're doing something different,
they got an informant inside one of the cartels that's fucking, I don't know, but there's got to be something, right?
Right. And plus, they were up on a wiretap. So I'm like, okay. So then at the next meeting, the numbers go up again. So I grabbed Jim Needles, who was a great guy, who was a good boss. I worked for him in New York, worked for him in Phoenix. So I'm like, Jim, what the fuck? And he's like, Pete, he goes, I don't even really know exactly what they're doing. He goes, I could tell you that if you or I were running the case, it wouldn't be getting run this way. I could assure you that. So I'm like, okay.
Pete, how does who's supervising Group 7 and allowing those tactics to be employed?
A different ASAC, a guy named George Gillette, who had come in from headquarters.
Does he ever work a real case? I mean, does this guy have any street background for this kind of work?
He actually had a horrible reputation as just not being a trustworthy guy. But I mean, it's still at this point, his reputation was that he was a prick. But I would never still envision that.
As long as the guy's competent, you can be a prick. Just be a competent prick.
Right, right. So, but again, so George is supervising that group. My understanding, and this is in hindsight, and again, I didn't put anything in the book that I didn't personally witness or see,
Sure.
is that George was kind of steering this whole concept of the investigation because his boss, Bill Newell, who was the special agent in charge of the Phoenix Field Division, was very inexperienced guy, and it doesn't give him a pass. You have a duty to know what's going on, and you're the captain of the ship. But Bill just didn't know any better,
right?
And was so
how does the briefing go where I sell you on this concept that you sign off on it, that it makes sense?
Yeah, I can't answer because I wasn't present for
no,
that.
I get it, but I just like,
yeah, no, it's appalling.
You know what we're gonna do is to catch cocaine traffickers, we're gonna snort a bunch of cocaine for days with them because we want to gain their trust. And then, you know, wait, what are we doing? No, we're not doing that. So this is a case. So the Fast and Furious, did this go all the way to the DOJ? Because
no, there were briefing papers that were going up, and they were they had briefings where they would have to go, there were times where they even went to headquarters to do briefings with people. So I mean, I wasn't privy to them, but I would hear the conversations like, hey, get the briefing paper up to date, because I had to do briefing papers on other cases that weren't related to Fast and Furious as well, and I knew how they went up the chain of command. But it was weird because like with Fast and Furious, none of us knew what was going on again till much later in the case, around Christmas time of 2010, when a Border Patrol agent got killed. And then all of a sudden
that gun traced back to one of the guns that was walked across the border.
Correct. It was traced back to one of the straw purchasers. By the way, one of the straw purchasers in Fast and Furious, just one of them, purchased over 600 guns. I heard it was closer to 800 guns before Emory Hurley thought he was worth indicting. But here's where it gets weird. There were times where
I'm glad it gets weird at some point.
You can't make this stuff up,
brother.
There were times where, and again, you know, after the whole thing went sideways, I ran into Hope McAllister before I testified in front of Congress.
Yeah, I remember in the book. Yeah.
But after the the things got crazy, and I was like, Hope, what were you thinking? Because again, I went through the academy with her, drank beer with her. She was part of the, you know, she was a pleasant person.
Right.
And she told us, she was, Pete, there were times we wanted to stop the cars and we would call Emory, and Emory would say, well, yes, I understand that he bought all of these guns before, but how can we prove that this particular purchase isn't for his own personal use? So he would crap on them every time they had an idea to stop a car. Again, doesn't excuse it. Take it to the county, take it to the state. You don't let it ride off into the sunset. But here's another little tidbit, and it's not in the book because I couldn't fit everything in the book.
No doubt.
There was one deal where they went to the Scottsdale Gun Club, which is a nice, beautiful dealership. People were very cooperative with us for years. The straw purchasers are in there doing the transaction, and they see the ATF surveillance. Right now, these guys run with the cartels, you know, but they're also, you know, not stupid people, so they get scared. Like, is this other rival cartel people? Like, what's going on?
Right. Yeah.
So they call the Scottsdale police. So the Scottsdale police come. Right. The transaction happens. The Scottsdale police escort the straw purchasers off the site and then let them go when they ride off into the sun. Now, Scottsdale PD didn't know they were straw purchasers. The Scottsdale Gun Club knew that these were ATF targets, and they were told to just go ahead with the deal. We got it. So, I mean, that's how muddy and crazy this whole scenario got. That went on for quite some time before John Dodson stepped forward.
And so everybody in Phoenix is just going, that's not in Group 7 is going, this is, you know, you got agents actually defending, like, not knowing that this is true. They're like, there was one of your counterparts that had a relationship and was like a liaison for the Mexican Attorney General's office or something. And he assured him that no ATF agent in the history of the organization would ever allow guns to be walked across the border.
That was Carlos Canino. He's old school guy, did a lot of undercover. I don't know if you ever heard the story where Jay Dobbins infiltrated the Hells Angels.
Yeah, of course. I've met Jay. Yeah, Jay's good people.
Great guy. Jay's a good man. Carlos actually was undercover in the, you know, they put up like a fake motorcycle gang together. Carlos was one of those guys. He did a lot of undercover, real hard, you know, scary stuff that he was involved in.
Solid guy, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, Carlos was the attaché to Mexico at the time. He was like, you know, so he was the #1 guy in our Mexico City office. So Carlos like everybody else, was like, hey, this Dodson's full of shit. Like, we don't walk guns. So like, we all thought that John, when he first blew the whistle, was crazy. So what happened is, finally, when they get around to indicting the straw purchasers, 2,000 guns into it, Carlos came up for the briefing in Arizona. So Carlos approaches me, and I had met Carlos at the academy. Again, old school. I didn't really know him very well at the time. We've since become like really good friends. And he's like, Pete, can you believe this fucking Dodson guy? And I'm like, I said, Carlos, I don't think he's lying.
I remember in the book, you're like, hey, I think he's telling the truth.
Right. So anyway, Carlos is like, no way. Right. So anyway, Carlos then grabs a copy of the operational plan, and I'm watching Carlos read it, and he's reading it while they're giving the presentation on the takedown. And I literally, again, this is a tough guy. He's an old bullshit guy. I literally watch him get almost physically sick, to the point where his knees buckle, and he looks like he's going to vomit. And he's like, I can't fucking believe this. And I'm like, Carlos, I told you. I said, I didn't believe it either. He's like, no, you don't understand, Pete. He goes, Maricela, which was the Attorney General of Mexico. She was like the Eric Holder of Mexico at the time. And was really trying to do, she's not like the current regime that doesn't give a shit. She was really trying to, put it to the cartels.
Right.
He's like, Pete, she's my friend. And I've been telling her all along, because rumblings started to make it down to Mexico, that this isn't who we are. This isn't what we do. He goes, I fucking lied to her. He goes, now I got to go tell her I've been lying to her. He goes, but he didn't know he was lying.
Of course. But that's still a tough,
Yeah.
Crazy. So Fast and Furious is well underway. Word's getting out that Phoenix ATF, and we can say Group 7, but they're not going to make that distinction in the media. Really, it's
all they made it sound like it was all of us.
Phoenix ATF is walking guns to Mexico, and it wasn't until they started looking at the whistleblower,
John Dodson. Yeah, what happened was, I was at a supervisor's meeting, just like the other ones I talked about. Happened every Monday, and Bill Newell had come back from the U.S. Attorney's office, and he goes, "Yep, U.S. Attorney's really pissed at John Dodson for reaching out to Grassley staff." I'm like, okay. Now, but by this time,
we're getting congressmen involved, and senators,
so his next breath is like, "Don't be surprised if John Dodson doesn't find himself indicted. I'd stay away from him if I were you guys." So I'm just sitting there, and this is when my blood starts to boil, because now, like I said, now we're starting to hear what really happened, and I'm like, wait a minute, all of these firearms traffickers that I referred to this U.S. Attorney's office for prosecution, that they said no. The CI 921 barred from ever using him. Excalibur Arms case, no thanks. Right? The Victor Varela case, no thanks. Now they're going to indict John Dodson, perhaps. So I went home and I sat down. I think if I'm not mistaken, I think I had some 1800 tequila at the time, and I stepped it with my wife and said, "Listen, this is what's going on." And she was like, "Well, if you're the man I married, you're going to say something to somebody." And so I wound up the next morning calling Senator Grassley's office. I spoke to a guy named John Dodson. I was like, "Hey, John, I know you're being told by DOJ and by ATF that John Dodson is a liar. He's not lying. And if you give me a subpoena, I'll tell you everything you want to know."
Right.
And lo and behold, not too long after they did.
And I got to tell you, so listen, I've known you for all of about 45 minutes now. Leadership's easy, man, when there's nothing on the line. You've got a whole, you saw what they were willing to do to the other agent, because he told the truth. Like, it wasn't, listen, you get in trouble when you lie. You shouldn't get in trouble when you tell the truth. Isn't that like a cornerstone of what we expect? And so you step into the ring, man. You step into the ring. You said, "Hey, here I am. He's telling the truth, and I can verify because I have all the documents, emails, and chronologically listed everything that's been going on with Hurley and everybody else at the federal U.S. Attorney's office that refuses to do their jobs." Ooh, holy smokes. While that hearing is going on, and while you get subpoenaed and brought before Congress, how does, and I apologize, how does the guy making hand grenades and who's the armorer for the Mexican cartels converting all their fire, how does where is that during this whole shit show?
Yeah, I inherited the Yuma group when Rene Jaquez well he wasn't showing up down there. So there was some issues. So Bill Newell transferred to me. So what happened was
That's right, salsa.
The guy's name was John Baptiste Kingery was the target. And
yes.
Initially, he was investigated by us for purchasing, I believe it was 4 AK-47s that vanished, that we believe went to Mexico, and that case was also declined for prosecution. So what happened was we started to get tips from people, like one of them was an Army Navy store. This guy Kingery went in and it just bought a bunch of inert grenades, but the guy was somehow suspicious and contacted ATF. So we start looking at Kingery. This is going on a little bit before, but kind of during the whole Fast and Furious scandal. So we believed, maybe he's taking them to Mexico, maybe he's making grenades here, maybe he's making desk lamps, who knows what he's doing. So we started to look at him. But as time progressed, it became pretty clear when we looked at his border crossings and we looked at some of the other stuff he was doing that he was probably making IEDs. Like he was ordering parts for grenades, mostly training parts, but he was converting them, in Mexico from all over the country. So we felt like we had enough to arrest him. We reached out to Emory Hurley saying, hey, we wanted to arrest him, and we were told no. Then at one point, he got caught crossing the border with 114 disassembled grenades in his tires. Right. He confesses to us that, yeah, I've made probably around 800 grenades for the Sinaloa cartel. Yeah, I take the AR-15 rifles and the AK-47 variant rifles, and I convert them into machine guns down there. So we get this full confession. We say we want to lock him up. We're told, no, it's not enough. We need more. So for the first time in my life, and look, as a homicide detective, you know this, you make your bread and butter in the interview room. It was the first time that I ever interviewed a guy where and again, my agents were conducting the interview. We interviewed the guy for hours, right? We're told we can't arrest him unless we get more. We bring him back in that very day and interview him some more. So what we get out of him at that point is, yeah, I also transport thumb drives sometimes across the border. And well, what's in the thumb drive? Well, sometimes it's instructions on people that need to be dealt with on the U.S. side. Sometimes it's information. Okay, fall back. No, let him go. Maybe we'll indict it in a couple of weeks. And I'm like, you got to be fucking kidding me. So at this point, I'm calling the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York because they had done a case on the Sinaloa cartel. So can you bring this into your bigger conspiracy? We're told no.
Sure.
We were cooperating with Mexico through the Mexican Attorney General's office, but they didn't have enough on that side. So we had to let this guy go. So, and he was free for some time. But the worst part is, while we're trying to move forward on him, Emory Hurley drops all communications with my agents. So my agents are emailing him. They're trying to call him because they want to move forward on this guy because he's making, in essence, small bombs for the cartel.
Right.
And we couldn't get Emory to move an inch. Which, by the way, when I testified, before I testified in front of Congress at the open hearing, which is kind of a political showmanship, there was a deposition that lasted for about 6 hours that happened in a hotel. And I laid most of this stuff out to them. And even the congressional folks were like stunned by what was happening there.
So I've got some questions before we close out. But so you give your testimony because it's kind of like you're backing up your other agent who's already blown the whistle. Like this guy's we're verified. He's telling you the truth. And this is what I know. All that information gets put out there on an official congressional record, right? You've been subpoenaed. What happens next?
Well, first thing I didn't know John Dodson. I didn't know. Right. I might have met him at the range. If I did, it would have been hello, goodbye. Like, right. I don't know that I ever met him personally before that, but I knew what was going on in Phoenix up to that point. And it just made sense when I knew that he was telling the truth about walking guns. Whether I knew him or not, it was the right thing to do was to step up. But so what happened is the first conversations that I had where it was in-depth conversations was at a deposition with the congressional investigators. So it happened at a hotel about 6 blocks away from my office. So I parked at my office, walked over, sat down with them. And in the room were staffers from Grassley's office, Senator Leahy's office, Chairman Darrell Issa, who was the chairman of oversight at the time, and Elijah Cummings, who was the ranking member. So they weren't there. Their staffs were there. Gotcha. And they were all lawyers. So they asked great questions. I mean, this was a long, drawn-out process. I tell them everything. I mean, I laid everything on the table, which was good and bad. So I leave and I'm walking back to my office and I get a phone call from someone from the U.S. Attorney's office because I got along with some of those folks that wanted to do their jobs there.
Right.
And he's like, "Hey, Pete, you need to watch your back." You mean? He goes, "Everything you said in that deposition room was related to the U.S. Attorney, which is the chief federal law enforcement officer for the state of Arizona."
Right.
So I'm like, "Oh boy, here it comes."
Yeah. Right.
A couple of days later, I get a phone call from another AUSA saying, "Hey, man, I need to grab coffee with you." Okay. And I kind of knew at this point, I pissed them off.
Right.
So he slides an email across the table to me, and it was from Dennis Burke, who was the United States Attorney, to all his whole staff, saying anybody running into Pete Forcelli, even if it's on the weekend and he's having family with his coffee with his family, it is to be reported to me through your chain of command immediately. I'm like, oh boy, it's getting ugly. So yeah, and that's kind of where it started. So by the time I actually testified in front of Congress, where I was televised on C-SPAN, all that stuff, not that anybody watches C-SPAN.
No.
But while I'm testifying, I find out from another ATF agent who I had worked with in Phoenix that had since transferred to headquarters that the chief of the criminal division, it's kind of a big deal in Phoenix, chief of the criminal division for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Arizona, was present in headquarters while I was testifying, telling the director of ATF and other people that were there monitoring my testimony that I was perjuring myself. So it literally got to the point where I had to call the inspector general's office on myself and say, "Listen, I've been accused of a felony.
Yeah, man.
And you guys need to come and investigate it," because I didn't want to go through my career with this specter hanging over. So I was like laying all the cards on the table and saying, "All right, let's bring it."
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I'm perjuring myself. You offered to take numerous polygraphs, right?
6 times.
I mean, yeah. Nobody ever took you up on that offer.
No, and I look, I think it was because if they did it, then they would have proof I was telling the truth. So it was easy to say, "Oh no, it's not necessary."
Right.
Because
right.
in essence, what it became is me versus people at the U.S. Attorney's office, like a he said, they said thing.
Sure.
And this lasted for about 4 years.
How is your mental health during this time, Pete?
I was stressed out and pissed off. And I later found out I had PTSD, and I don't know if that helped or hurt me, but part of me was like, I felt like I had nothing to lose
Right.
at some point. And I eventually wound up, getting some help for what I was going through from 9/11. But,
Right.
it was a combination of things. Like one of the other things is, look, I lost many friends over the years, and I was like,
Sure.
here I am, I'm my back against the wall. And those guys gave everything. Like, how dare I even think about giving less? So I was just going to stick to the truth and do what I could do to defend my reputation, because it was important to me that, look, I came into this profession whole. I was going to leave whole, reputation wise, as much
Right.
health wise as I could.
Yeah,
So yeah,
man.
I fought tooth and nail just to set the record straight. And luckily, look, I think it's important for your listeners to know I did have support from within the agency and from some people who eventually made it to some high positions. One of whom was a guy named Tom Brandon, who literally told me, he goes, "As long as you're telling the truth, I have your back." And
Right.
Tom soon became the deputy director of ATF when they cleaned house,
Right.
and he kept his word. So I think that's an important thing in leadership too,
Absolutely.
to realize that you have guys like that who, as long as you're doing the right thing, they'll do the right thing for you.
Right.
There were some
No.
others too.
No, that's important. It's kind of helps to restore a little bit of the faith that you have in the institution, right? When you have guys like that are, I won't say being stand up, but just like doing what they say they're going to do, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So this whole so after the hearings, Pete, where does all this go, man? Because I know you you got in touch with several, you had a good relationship with some reporters, which was important because everybody's trying to spin the story, and if something gets repeated enough times, it becomes a truth. So you've got to actually take kind of a proactive approach to insulating your name and your reputation and all the work that you've done.
Yeah, well, I found a lot of the reporting to be very political. So
Right.
what I did was there were two politicians, two reporters who I found to be straight shooters, honest brokers in this particular case. One was William Lajeunesse from Fox News, and the other was a guy named Evan Perez. He's now at CNN, but he was back then at the Wall Street Journal. So what happened was I told them everything. I said, "Look, this is exactly so," and it was a good thing because I had a conversation with Evan the day after I testified. We went out, had dinner, drank a lot of beer.
Yeah.
I told him about the Kingery case because no
Right.
one really, people didn't latch on to the Kingery case for some reason. But anyway, what happened was after I blew the whistle, the U.S. Attorney's Office tried to twist the facts around on the Kingery case. Is like, well, Pete didn't really want to arrest that guy. But Evan knew all the steps I had taken, that I dealt with Mexico, that I dealt with Southern District. So I
Sure.
was literally meeting with him one day, and he had just gotten a call from the public information officer from the Department of Justice saying, hey, I know you're covering the story. Just want to let you know that Embry Hurley's not a bad guy. He's not the bad guy here. Pete Forcelli is a hypocrite. He was walking grenades while he was testifying about walking guns. So Evan is like, really? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Is that your story? Well, do you know otherwise? Yeah. So is that, well, no, we're not going to cling to that story. So they backed off. I mean, they were literally trying to sling mud in real time while things were going on. And this went on for a while. But yeah, I was trying to be proactive, but I also was really proactive at not being political. So like if I called the staffers, because I needed top cover,
right.
I would never just call one. I'd call each of the four staffs, which was interesting because Leahy's staff would never pick up the phone. And I actually think it was Leahy's staff in hindsight. And I try not to speculate too much, but I'm pretty solid on this one. They were probably the ones who called Burke's office because he was the chairman of judiciary back at the time. Cummings was pleasant enough, but it was, it was Grassley's staff, frankly, who did the most fighting because his passion was always whistleblowers. And I'll tell you, they kept their word.
Because he has that, he drafted that whistleblower act, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. And look, he's another one. His team, every time I called, they picked up the phone and we had conversations. And look, the other thing is I made mistakes, along the way. Like one of them with the Kingery case was there was a time where I demanded my agents have somebody posted on the block when we were doing surveillance instead of relying on the technology because I'm an old fart and I didn't trust the technology.
Right,
and
right.
Our surveillance got burned. So I put all the stuff that I did that I could have done better on the table too.
Sure.
Because I'm not perfect. And I think it's important to put everything out there, explain what you did, why you did it. And I found that if you're being honest and you're doing your best to do the right thing, that you'll land on your feet.
Well said. What so this comes to fruition. Pete, what happens? I know you give a kind of here's where they're at now, kind of at the end of the book.
Yeah.
What happens with that Fast and Furious case and like bring us home, man?
Sure. Well, the SAC, special agent in charge of the Phoenix Field Division, and the 2A SACs got yanked out immediately. The case, they were transferred to other U.S. attorneys' offices because of conflicts. People at the U.S. Attorney's Office, Dennis Burke had to resign because my understanding is, and this is coming from Evan Perez, he was the DOJ reporter at the time, they were going to can him because of Fast and Furious, but even more so, I was told, because of the Kingery case, because Burke had authorized us to do a cross-border operation and let the Mexicans take Kingery into custody, and that didn't quite work out because of some problems with Mexico. So I heard that was his death knell. Pat Cunningham, who was the chief of the criminal division that accused me of perjury, he had to resign and plead the fifth because he didn't want to testify in front of Congress. But the other people who had the most blood on their hands stayed in the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Hurley got actually promoted, didn't he?
No, he got transferred to a position with a little bit less responsibility, but the same pay.
Yeah.
And Rachel Hernandez, who kind of helped pave that path, is now the second in command of the Phoenix U.S. Attorney's Office. She's the first assistant. She's still there. So, but then when an ATF, Bill Newell was removed. So was George Gillette and Jim Needles. And Jim Needles' only mistake was Jim signed off on one ops plan. This guy, great agent, great mentor.
Yeah, he was saying he's a great guy.
Yeah, I respected Jim, but he actually signed off on an ops plan that was for an undercover deal that was submitted to him, and those guns walked. Unfortunately, it was 6 guns, and that was enough to end Jim's career. So he finished out. He was able to retire, but here was a guy who would have been a great leader at a higher level who never was allowed to promote any higher. But some of the other people, they were removed for not paying attention. The director of ATF, Ken Melson, at the time was removed. So was the deputy director, Billy Hoover. Hope McAllister is still an agent with ATF, and pretty much the rest of them are gone. But they weren't gone immediately. You know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. But in the big picture, I know the DOJ had a lot of mud on their face over this. But you know what I find kind of interesting, and maybe it's my naivete. There's a story the next day. It's like you say Fast and Furious, you read but there wasn't, other than those people. I mean, there's still a bunch of dead people. There's still, the people that I think should have been held accountable never really were. The people that were given basically a pass for their incompetence. And then there's another story. It gets like pushed back into, oh yeah, well it's like, what's the takeaway, man? What's the lesson learned? How does Fast and Furious or something like that, how does that not get repeated? Is that a fair question, or is that?
No, it's entirely fair. And this looks one of the reasons I wrote the book is because
Right.
the real story, like how we got there, was never told. Like the incompetence that was happening in Phoenix was never told. So those who don't know history are bound to repeat it. I firmly believe
Right.
that. No, things are bad. Look, the other thing is the Kingery's grenades weren't all recovered. They're still out there. Right. Of the guns that were trafficked in Fast and Furious, they're still out there as well. Not all of them. I think last I heard was about 1,000 of them have since been either recovered or turned up. But I mean, they're not loaves of bread. They're not apples or oranges. They're not going to rot. They'll continue to be used till they turn up at a crime scene, right? Which is where they're found. So people will continue to die at the other end of Fast and Furious weapons, probably long after I'm dead, if I die an old man.
Right.
But yeah, could it happen again? Absolutely. And look, part of the problem is people like to say, oh, the cover up is worse than the crime. I would say that if Brian Terry wasn't dead, the Border Patrol agent who was killed that led to John Dodson blowing the whistle, and if countless Mexicans weren't dead. So, I mean, the crime itself is actually pretty damn bad. But, and then even the politics of it. Oh, Eric Holder claimed he didn't know. He damn well knew because the briefing papers were going up through the Department of Justice. And if you remember, Barack Obama said, well, I found out about it when everybody else found out about it when I read it in the paper. Well, then your wingman, Eric Holder, didn't do you any justice because he knew the train was coming. And if he didn't warn you, hey, Barack, there's a big train coming our way, then he wasn't much of a leader either. So, I mean, just the fact that no one was honest and open is problematic because, when you don't put all the cards on the table and discuss things that are broken, you can't fix them. So could they happen again? Hell yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I can't say enough about the book, Pete. I really it's just so well done. Keeleen McGregor helped with the writing.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
Oh no, please! I'm glad you brought her up because she's an unsung hero in the writing of the book itself. I wrote a 174,000 word manuscript, which is way too long for a book.
Right.
And it read like a long police report because I'm a cop. I don't write.
Yeah,
like
no
a
doubt,
writer.
no doubt.
So it was suggested that I bring in an editor, and full disclosure, her father is my literary agent, which I never in a million years thought I would have a literary agent. So he suggested that, hey, would you mind having my daughter look at it? Because, it's expensive to have somebody come in and edit. So she did it, and did a great job. And she took what was a dry, boring, very long police report and made it a lot more fun to read and cut it down about in half.
Yeah. Well, I thank her for that because I listen, I loved it. I finished it in 2 days. I sat down outside. I was probably 3 hours into it, and my wife's like, Are you gonna join us tonight? I'm like, all right. I mean, I could have read it straight through, front to back. It was extremely well written. The Deadly Path: How Operation Fast and Furious and Bad Lawyers Armed the Mexican Cartels. Pete Forcelli, thank you for taking the time, brother, man. I've really enjoyed our time together. I definitely enjoyed the book. I'm going to put links to purchase the book in the show notes so the readers can do that if they wanted to. I'm assuming Amazon.
Yeah, Amazon. It's available on all the big box bookstores, websites as well. But no. And listen, I appreciate the invite to be here. It's been an honor to chat with you. And if I could ever be of assistance to you in the future, reach out, man. It's been a pleasure,
brother. Good seeing you.
Take care.
And that is that.